That morning, my wedding house wasn't quiet. It was vacant on purpose. I found one envelope containing one sentence. Try doing this without us. They boarded a flight to Paris like they were leaving a bad movie, never realizing the cameras were already rolling. The man waiting at the altar wasn't just my fiancé. He was the reason my sister's Paris flex was about to collapse in front of the whole internet. My name is Ava Mitchell. I am 34 years old. And on the morning of what was supposed to be the most significant day of my life, I woke up to a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Usually, a wedding house on the morning of the ceremony is a chaotic symphony of anxiety and joy. There should have been the sound of blow dryers humming in the bathrooms. There should have been the clinking of mimosa glasses toasting to the future. There should have been the frantic zipping of garment bags and the rhythmic thud of suitcases being moved from room to room. I expected my mother's high-pitched voice criticizing the humidity in Annapolis. I expected my father's low grumble about the cost of the parking. Most of all, I expected my sister, Kendall, to be commanding the room, making my wedding about her schedule, her hair, her needs. Instead, the digital clock on the bedside table simply blinked 7 in the morning. The rental house, a sprawling colonial property near the water in Annapolis, Maryland, was still. It was the kind of stillness that usually comes after a disaster, not before a celebration. The air conditioning clicked on, a mechanical gasp that startled me. I sat up, the sheets on the other bed in the room, the one reserved for my maid of honor, were perfectly smooth, not a wrinkle, not a dent. No one had slept there. I swung my legs out of bed. The floorboards were cold against my bare feet. I walked into the hallway. The door to my parents' room was wide open. The bed was made. The closets were open and empty, the wire hangers chiming softly against each other in the draft from the vent. It was a clean sweep. A strange calmness washed over me. Panic usually tastes like metal in the back of your throat, but this tasted like nothing. It was just numb. I walked down the stairs, my hand sliding along the polished wooden banister. I counted the steps. 1, 2, 3. I focused on the mechanics of walking because if I stopped to think about the reality of the situation, I might not be able to start again. I entered the kitchen. The granite island was bare except for a single object placed dead center. It was a white envelope. It sat there with the precision of a court summons. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Kendall's. Her loops were large and performative, the kind of penmanship that demanded attention. She had written my name, Ava, in black ink. The letters were thick. She had pressed down hard. I didn't tear it open. I slid my finger under the flap and lifted it gently, preserving the paper. Inside, there was a single sheet of hotel stationery. It wasn't folded. It was just laid flat inside. I pulled it out. There was no "Dear Ava." There was no "We are sorry." There was no explanation about emergencies or sudden illnesses. There was just one sentence, scrawled in the center of the page, floating in all that white space. Try doing this without us. I stared at the words. I read them once. I read them twice. I read them until the black ink seemed to separate from the paper and float in the air. Try doing this without us. It was a challenge. It was a taunt. It was the final punchline to a joke I hadn't realized they had been telling for 34 years. My family did not just leave. They had boycotted my existence. I put the paper down on the counter. My hand was steady. I walked to the front door and unlocked it. The heavy oak door swung open to reveal the driveway. Yesterday, that driveway had been full. My parents' rented SUV had been there. Kendall's convertible had been there. There had been boxes of decorations, favors for the guests, and the emergency kits for the bridal party. Now, it was just gray asphalt and fallen leaves. The emptiness was violent. It felt like someone had taken an eraser to my life and rubbed it raw. They had taken everything, the personalized robes we were supposed to wear for the photos, the boxes of flowers my mother insisted on arranging herself, the jewelry I was supposed to borrow. They had packed it all up in the middle of the night, loaded their cars, and driven away while I slept. They wanted me to wake up to nothing. They wanted me to walk out that door and feel the crushing weight of my own insignificance. I closed the door. I locked it. I didn't want the world to see the emptiness yet. I walked back into the living room. The morning light was streaming through the bay windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. On the small table by the window, something caught the light. It was glossy. I walked over. It was a boarding pass. They had left it intentionally. If they had dropped it by accident, it would be on the floor. This was placed perfectly on the coaster, facing out, so I couldn't miss it. I picked it up. It was for Skyloom Airlines. I looked at the flight number, SL221. I looked at the departure time. It had left Dulles International Airport 3 hours ago. And then I looked at the destination code, CDG, Paris. My stomach turned. Paris? Of course it was Paris. Kendall had been talking about Paris for 6 months. She had been complaining that my wedding in Maryland was quaint and provincial compared to the European summer she deserved. She had made jokes about skipping the reception to go to the airport. I had laughed. I had thought she was being dramatic. I had thought she was just being Kendall. But she wasn't joking. She was planning. I looked at the date on the ticket. It was today. They had booked this months ago. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They had never intended to stay. They had come to the rehearsal dinner. They had eaten the food. They had smiled for the photos, all while holding tickets to Paris in their pockets. They had treated my wedding weekend as a layover. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The sound was loud in the empty house. I walked over and picked it up. A notification from Instagram flashed on the screen. It was Kendall. Kendall M_style just added to their story. My finger hovered over the screen. Part of me wanted to throw the phone through the window. Part of me wanted to delete the app and pretend I didn't exist. But the engineer in me, the part of me that analyzed data at the Northridge Aeronautics Lab before they ruined that too, needed to see the evidence. I tapped the screen. The photo filled the display. It was a selfie. Kendall was in the foreground, wearing oversized sunglasses and a designer trench coat that cost more than my venue deposit. Behind her, out of focus, but clearly visible, were my parents. They were holding glasses of champagne. They were in the first-class lounge. My mother was smiling. A genuine smile, the kind she never gave me. My father looked relaxed, reading a newspaper, but it was the caption that made the air leave the room. Paris heals better than weddings. She had added a champagne bottle emoji and a plane emoji. I watched the story bar at the top tick forward. Then the next photo appeared. It was a shot of their passports and boarding passes stacked together. 3 of them. The caption on this one was even shorter. Au revoir. Drama. I lowered the phone. I stood there in the silent kitchen of a rented house, gripping the edge of the granite counter until my knuckles turned white. I waited for the tears. I waited for the sobbing, the heaving chest, the collapse to the floor that you see in movies. I waited for the heartbreak, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt a click. It was a mechanical sensation, like a breaker tripping in a fuse box to prevent a fire. The part of me that had spent 3 decades trying to please them, trying to earn their attention, trying to be good enough to be considered family. Just shut off. It didn't fade away. It didn't wither. It snapped. For years. I had been the peacekeeper. I was the one who apologized when Kendall stole my ideas. I was the one who stayed silent when my mother critiqued my appearance. I was the one who worked harder, saved more, and demanded less, hoping that one day they would look at me and see someone worth loving. I looked at the envelope again. Try doing this without us. They thought they were punishing me. They thought that by stripping away the guests, the family, and the facade of support, they would leave me broken. They thought I would call them, begging, crying, asking them to come back, promising to give Kendall whatever attention she wanted. I folded the letter. I didn't crumble it. I folded it along the existing creases, sharp and precise. I walked over to my purse sitting on the chair and tucked the letter inside the zippered pocket. I placed the boarding pass right next to it. I was not throwing them away. You do not throw away evidence. You file it. I walked back upstairs to the master bedroom. Hanging on the door of the closet, inside a white garment bag, was my dress. They hadn't taken that. Maybe they thought it was too heavy to carry. Maybe they thought it was funnier to leave it behind, a ghost of a wedding that wasn't going to happen, or maybe, in their arrogance, they just didn't care. I unzipped the bag. The fabric shimmered in the morning light. It was simple, elegant, structural. It was a dress for a woman who knew who she was, even if her family didn't. "Try doing this without us," I whispered to the empty room. My voice didn't shake. It sounded stronger than it had in years. It sounded like the voice of the woman who built microgrids, the woman who solved problems that other people said were impossible. They thought the wedding was the performance. They thought the audience was the few dozen relatives and friends invited to the ceremony. They thought the story ended when they walked out the door. They were wrong. They didn't know about the cameras. They didn't know that the Coastal Morning Network had a production crew setting up at the venue right now. They didn't know that the live stream link had been shared with thousands of donors, environmental advocates, and tech investors across the country. And they certainly didn't know who was waiting for me at the altar. They thought I was marrying a sweet, quiet man who worked in renewable energy. They thought he was a nobody, just like they thought I was a nobody. They had never bothered to Google his last name. They had never bothered to ask about his company. They had been too busy planning their trip to Paris to realize that the man I was marrying wasn't just an engineer. He was a titan. And when I walked down that aisle today, I wouldn't be walking toward a tragedy. I would be walking toward a reveal that would shatter their little vacation faster than they could order room service. I reached out and touched the silk of my dress. The texture was cool under my fingertips. My family had left the stage. They had exited stage left, thinking they had turned off the lights on their way out. But they didn't realize that the show hadn't even started yet. And this time, they weren't the directors. They weren't the stars. They were just the villains in the backstory. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. My hair was messy. My face was pale. But my eyes were clear. There was no confusion in them anymore. "Okay," I said to the silence. "Watch me." To understand why I did not cry when I found that boarding pass, you have to go back 3 years. You have to go back to the day I learned that in the Mitchell family, the truth is flexible, but the hierarchy is absolute. I was working at Northridge Aeronautics Lab, in the world of aerospace engineering. Northridge was not just a company, it was the cathedral. It was a place of glass and steel and security clearances that took 6 months to process. Everything there was white and chrome. The air was filtered. The silence was respectful. We did not just build planes. We built the future of atmospheric travel. I was 31 years old, and I was the youngest senior structural analyst in my division. I wore my badge like a medal. I believed in the system. I believed that if you followed the rules, documented your work, and triple-checked your variables, you were safe. I was wrong. It happened on a Tuesday. I was called into the office of Director Vance. Usually, meetings with Vance were about budget overruns or timeline adjustments. But when I walked in, the blinds were drawn, the head of legal was there, so was the head of IT security. They did not ask me to sit down. Vance turned a monitor around. On the screen was a proprietary schematic for a high-altitude stabilizer fin. It was classified internal data, and there, at the bottom of the file, was the transmission log. The file had been sent to an external server, a public server hosting a design competition called the Global Future Aviation Contest, and authorized by the digital signature of Ava Mitchell. I stared at the screen. The timestamp was 2 a.m. on a Sunday. I told them it was impossible. I told them I was asleep. I told them I would never breach protocol for a contest, let alone leak proprietary data. I pleaded with them to look at my record. I had never been late. I had never missed a deadline. I was a ghost in the machine, efficient and invisible. The head of IT looked at me with bored eyes. He said that digital signatures do not lie. He said the upload came from my personal IP address. He said the device ID matched my home laptop. The system does not care about your character. The system only cares about the logs. I was placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. My badge was taken. My access was revoked. I was escorted out of the building by a security guard I had greeted every morning for 4 years. He did not look me in the eye. As I stood in the parking lot, holding a box of my personal effects, I felt the first crack in my foundation. I realized then that you can build a life on perfect discipline, but it only takes one error to bring it down, even if that error is not yours. I went home. I tore my apartment apart. I checked my router logs. I checked my laptop history. The IT guy was right. The file had been sent from my computer. But I hadn't sent it. Then I saw the browser history. Interspersed with the upload timestamps were searches for Paris Fashion Week trends, how to get famous fast, and luxury travel influencers. I froze. 2 nights before the leak, Kendall had come over. She had been crying about a breakup. She said she needed to get out of her apartment. She said she just wanted to eat ice cream and watch movies. I had let her stay. I had gone to bed early because I had a briefing the next morning. I left my laptop on the coffee table because Kendall said she wanted to stream a movie, and her phone screen was too small. My password was on a sticky note inside the drawer. It was against protocol, but she was my sister. I drove to my parents' house that evening. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I walked into the dining room where they were eating dinner. It was pot roast. The smell of gravy and roasted carrots usually made me feel safe. That night, it made me nauseous. I threw the printouts of the logs on the table. Kendall didn't even flinch. She just looked at the papers, then took a sip of her wine. I demanded an explanation. I told them I was facing termination. I told them I could be sued for intellectual property theft. I told them my career, the career I had built while Kendall was dropping out of 3 different colleges, was over. Kendall sighed. She looked at me like I was overreacting to a spilled drink. She said she found the design on my desktop. She said it looked futuristic and cool. She submitted it to the contest under a pseudonym. But she needed a verified engineer's signature to bypass the entry filter. She used mine. She said she didn't think it was a big deal. She just wanted to win the prize money. She wanted to use the cash to launch her brand. I did it for us, Ava, she said, her voice dripping with that manipulative sweetness I knew too well. Imagine the press if I won. We could have been a team. I looked at my father. He was cutting his meat. He was concentrating on the knife and fork, refusing to look up. He was a man who hated conflict more than he loved justice. His silence was a wall I could not scream through. I looked at my mother. I expected outrage. I expected her to stand up and scream at Kendall. I expected her to defend the daughter who paid her mortgage when things got tight. The daughter who never asked for bail money or help with rent. My mother set down her fork. She dabbed her mouth with a napkin. She looked at me with a pity that felt like a slap. Ava, she said, her voice calm and reasonable. You have to understand, Kendall is an artist. She sees opportunities where you only see rules. She wasn't trying to hurt you. She was trying to break through. She stole classified data. Mom, I said, my voice trembling. I lost my job. You can get another job, my mother said. You are smart. You are the worker. But Kendall just thinks bigger than you. She needs a runway. You are the ground crew. That is just how it is. That was the moment. It wasn't the theft. It was the definition. You are the ground crew. I realized then that in their movie, I was the extra. I was the supporting character who exists solely to facilitate the protagonist's journey. If I had to be fired so Kendall could have a shot at a prize she didn't earn, that was an acceptable trade in my mother's economy. I walked out of that house. I didn't go back for 3 months, but I eventually did go back, because that is what victims of emotional erosion do. We go back. We hope that this time, the script will change. I was formally fired from Northridge a week later. They didn't press charges, mostly to avoid the public embarrassment of admitting their security was breached by a fashion school dropout using her sister's password. But I was blacklisted from the major aerospace firms. I spent the next 2 months in a fog. I felt useless. My identity was tied to my title. And without it, I was just a woman in a rented apartment with too much time and a severance package that was running out to keep myself sane. I started volunteering. I couldn't build planes, so I helped build stages for local events. One evening, I was working at a fundraiser for the Chesapeake Bay Conservation Alliance. It was a fancy event, full of local politicians and wealthy donors drinking Chardonnay and talking about saving the crabs while wearing shoes that cost more than a boat. I was in the back, near the audio equipment, trying to fix a wiring issue with the microphone stand. I was wearing black cargo pants and a t-shirt. I was invisible again, which was how I liked it. "You are using the wrong gauge wire for that load," a voice said. I turned around. Standing there was a man. He looked remarkably average. He was wearing a flannel shirt that had been washed too many times and a pair of jeans that had grease stains on the pocket. He had a beer in a plastic cup. He didn't look like a donor. He looked like someone who had wandered in from the docks. "Excuse me?" I said, defensive. "The resistance is too high," he said, pointing at the setup. "It's going to overheat if the mayor talks for more than 10 minutes, which, knowing the mayor, he will." I looked at the wire. He was right. I swapped it out. "Thanks," I said. "Are you an electrician?" "Something like that," he said. He leaned against the wall. He didn't seem interested in mingling with the crowd. He watched the people in their tuxedos and gowns with a look of mild amusement. "I'm Ava," I said. "Nolan," he replied. We stood there for an hour. We didn't talk about the weather or the appetizers. We talked about load-bearing structures. We talked about the efficiency of solar panels versus wind turbines. I found myself telling him about Northridge. I didn't tell him about Kendall. I just told him I had been designed to build high-altitude machines, and now I was grounded. I told him I felt like a failure because I wasn't climbing the ladder anymore. Nolan listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer platitudes. He had this intensity to his listening, like he was downloading the information rather than just hearing it. When I finished venting about my lost promotion and the unfairness of the industry, he took a sip of his beer and looked me right in the eye. "Ava," he said, "you are obsessed with the container, not the contents. You want the badge. You want the office. You want the permission to be great." "I worked hard for that permission," I snapped. "I know," he said softly. "But let me ask you something. If you stopped proving yourself, if you stopped trying to show them you are good enough to be in their club, what would you actually build?" The question hung in the humid air between us. What would you build? Not what would you execute for a boss. Not what would you design to get a grade. What would I build? I realized I didn't know. I had spent my whole life building things to make my parents look at me. I had built grades. I had built a resume. I had built a reputation. But I hadn't built a legacy. "Energy," I said, the word coming out before I thought about it. I would build energy systems, sustainable ones, microgrids for communities that get cut off when the storms hit, real things, not just concepts for contests. Nolan nodded. "Then go build that." "It's not that simple," I said. "The big firms won't hire me. I'm flagged." "So don't work for a big firm," he said. "Work for the work." 2 weeks later, I accepted a job at Harbor Light Microgrid. It was a small, gritty startup operating out of a converted warehouse in Baltimore. The pay was 60% of what I made at Northridge. The coffee was terrible. The office was freezing in the winter. My job wasn't designing sleek aerodynamic wings. It was designing battery storage units and optimizing outdated power lines for rural neighborhoods. When I told my family, Kendall laughed so hard she choked on her latte. "You're an electrician now?" she asked. God, Ava, that is so unsexy. Grid girls don't make money. You went from rockets to batteries. Talk about a downgrade. My mother just shook her head. "Well, at least you have a job," she said, in a tone that implied it was a temporary embarrassment we shouldn't mention in public. But I loved it. For the first time, I was solving problems that mattered. And Nolan was there. We started dating slowly. It wasn't a romance of fireworks and grand gestures. It was a romance of shared values. We hiked on weekends. We cooked dinner in my small apartment. We sat on the pier and watched the water. He never talked about his own work much. He said he was a consultant for renewable projects. He drove a 10-year-old truck that smelled like sawdust. He wore boots that he had clearly resoled twice. He never bought me expensive gifts. He brought me interesting rocks he found. He brought me books on thermodynamics. He brought me peace. I never asked him about his finances. I assumed he got by. Just like I did. I assumed he was another cog in the machine, another engineer who preferred the background. One night, about a year into our relationship, we were watching a documentary about a tech billionaire who had just bought a massive yacht. The guy was on screen, bragging about the gold-plated faucets. Gross, I muttered. Why do they always have to scream about what they have? Nolan looked at the screen, his expression unreadable. Because they think the money is who they are, he said quietly. They don't realize that the money is just a tool. If you identify with the title, you die when the title goes away. He turned to me, and his eyes were serious. Ava, he said, promise me something. Promise me you will never fall in love with a title, not yours, and not mine. That's easy, I laughed, leaning my head on his shoulder. You don't have a title. You're just Nolan. He kissed the top of my head. Good, he whispered. Keep thinking that. People who love titles leave when titles change. I need to know you're here for the man, not the seat he sits in. I didn't know it then, but he was giving me the key to everything. He was testing me. He was waiting to see if I was like my sister, who chased the shiny exterior, or if I was the woman who understood the wiring underneath. 3 years later, as I stood in that empty wedding house with Kendall's cruel note in my pocket, I finally understood the difference. Kendall had flown to Paris to chase a fantasy. She wanted the photo. She wanted the backdrop. I had stayed. I had chosen the work. I had chosen the man who drove the beat-up truck. And because I had chosen the reality over the illusion, I was the only one who knew the truth. The man waiting at the altar wasn't just Nolan the consultant, and the grid girl wasn't just a failure who couldn't keep a job at Northridge. We were about to show my family exactly what happens when you underestimate the people who build the world you live in. The venue was a machine of perfect execution. By 10 in the morning, the waterfront lawn at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Center had been transformed. I stood by the window of the bridal suite, watching the logistics unfold with a detached appreciation. It was military precision disguised as romance. The florists were weaving garlands of sea lavender and white roses along the wooden railings of the pier. The string quartet was tuning their instruments, a dissonant hum that drifted up on the salty breeze. Waiters moved in synchronized lines, placing crystal glasses on tables that sparkled under the Maryland sun. It was the wedding I had designed on spreadsheets and mood boards for 18 months. It was flawless, except for the gaping hole where the heart was supposed to be. The bridal suite was large, filled with mirrors and natural light meant to flatter complexion and capture joy. But the silence I had woken up to in the rental house had followed me here. There was no mother fussing with my veil. There was no father pacing nervously, practicing his toast. There was just me, and the growing pile of unopened texts on my phone, and the rhythmic sound of the waves hitting the pilings outside. The door burst open. It was Jules Parker, my best friend and maid of honor. Jules was a hurricane of organized chaos, the kind of woman who could manage a crisis while reapplying lipstick. She was carrying 2 garment bags, a steamer, and a look of murderous rage that was definitely not on the wedding schedule. She didn't say hello. She marched straight to me, grabbed my shoulders, and looked me in the eye. "I am going to kill them," she said. "I am going to fly to Paris, find them, and I am going to throw their croissants into the Seine." I didn't have to ask who she meant. "Show me," I said. "Ava, you don't want to see it," Jules said, trying to hide her phone behind her back. "It is trash. It is performative garbage. Show me. Jules." She sighed, defeated, and handed me the phone. It was Instagram again. Kendall had been busy since the airport. The new photo was high definition, clearly taken by a professional photographer she had likely hired the second they landed. She was sitting at a cafe table in the Marais district. The lighting was golden. She was wearing a vintage Chanel jacket, one I recognized because I had lent her the money to buy it 3 years ago. Money she never paid back. She was holding a macaron near her lips, looking away from the camera with feigned nonchalance. The caption read, "Some weddings are better skipped. Choosing myself. Paris over promises. Self-love." I scrolled down to the comments. Usually, Kendall's engagement was low, but drama sells. The comments section was a wildfire. "Wait, isn't your sister getting married today?" asked user Sarah Jenks. "Did you guys ditch her?" Savage. Wrote someone named Mike_T. "Where is her family?" "That is so cold." Wrote another. And then, buried in the mix, were the sycophants. "You look stunning." "Kenny, you deserve this trip. Forget the drama." My thumb hovered over the screen. It wasn't the public post that hurt the most. It was the notification banner that slid down from the top of the screen right as I was reading. A direct message from Kendall. I tapped it. "Don't beg. It's pathetic. You were never meant for our kind of life. Just sign the papers. Have your little party, and let us be the ones who actually make the Mitchell name mean something. We'll bring you a keychain." I stared at the words. Our kind of life. She meant the life of appearances. The life where you spend money you don't have to impress people you don't like. The life where a wedding is a networking event, and a sister is just a prop that didn't make the final cut. She honestly believed that by being in Paris. She had ascended to a plane of existence I couldn't touch. She thought she was the main character. "She is a monster," Jules said, reading over my shoulder. "Ava, seriously, say the word and I will hack her account. I know a guy." I handed the phone back to Jules. "No," I said. My voice was steady. "Let her post. Let her dig the hole." "Ava, are you okay?" Jules asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You are scaring me. You are too calm. You should be throwing vases." "I am done throwing things," I said. "I am building something." There was a knock on the door. It was a firm, two-tap knock. "Come in," I said. The door opened and Nolan walked in. I had not seen him since the rehearsal dinner the night before, where he had politely listened to my father drone on about golf for 40 minutes. Today, he looked different. He was wearing a tuxedo, midnight blue, tailored to within a millimeter of perfection. But it wasn't the suit that changed him, it was his bearing. Nolan Pierce usually walked with a slouch, the posture of a man who spent his time in crawl spaces and utility closets. Today, he stood at his full height. He looked like iron. He took one look at the room, the missing mother, the missing father, the missing sister, and he didn't flinch. He didn't ask where they were. He knew. He had seen the empty driveway at the rental house when he came to pick up the groomsmen's supplies. He walked over to me and took my hands. His palms were warm and rough. "They aren't coming," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," I said. "They are in Paris." "Paris?" he repeated, testing the word like it was a bad taste. "Okay. I'm sorry," I said. "I know this looks bad. The guests are going to talk. Your family is going to wonder why I am an orphan today." Nolan shook his head. "My family knows exactly who you are. Ava. And the guests? They are about to see something much more interesting than a father-daughter dance." He squeezed my hands. "We are still getting married, right?" "Try and stop me," I said. "Good." He stepped back, but he didn't let go of my hand. He turned toward the door. "Mom, you can come in." Evelyn Pierce stepped into the room. I had only met Evelyn 3 times. She lived in Oregon and hated flying. She was a small woman with gray hair cut in a practical bob and eyes that were the exact same shade of observant hazel as Nolan's. She was wearing a simple navy dress that looked comfortable rather than expensive. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight up to me and placed her hands on my cheeks. "You are beautiful," she said. "Thank you, Evelyn," I managed to say. "I am sorry about the mess, my family." "Shh," she silenced me gently. "I heard, Nolan told me." She dropped her hands and looked at me with a ferocity that surprised me. 30 years ago, she said, her voice clear and strong. I stood on a dock not 5 miles from here. It was a hurricane, A real one. Category 3. My husband, Nolan's father, was out there. He was Coast Guard. He went out when everyone else was coming in. I knew Nolan's father had died in the line of duty, but I had never heard the details. He didn't come back, Evelyn continued. And do you know what I learned that day, standing on that dock in the rain? I shook my head. I learned that blood doesn't make you family, she said. The people who stood on that dock with me, holding me up when my knees gave out, they weren't my cousins or my parents. They were his crew. They were the people who showed up when the sky turned black. That is family. Ava. Family is who stays when the weather turns. She reached out and took my hand, placing it in Nolan's. Your people left for a vacation, Evelyn said. Let them go. Today. We stand as your family, and we don't leave. I felt a lump form in my throat, hot and sharp. For the first time all morning, the numbness cracked. I blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears ruin the makeup Jules had spent an hour perfecting. Thank you, I whispered. Nolan checked his watch. It was a cheap digital watch he refused to replace, contrasting sharply with his tuxedo. We have 30 minutes, Nolan said. Ava, there is something you need to know about the setup outside. I know about the cameras, I said. I saw the crew trucks. It is not just a crew, Nolan said. It's the Coastal Morning Network. My eyes widened. Coastal Morning wasn't a local access channel. It was a national syndicate. It was the kind of network that played in airport lounges and dentist offices across 40 states. They are live streaming the ceremony as the anchor event for the Save the Bay campaign, Nolan explained. We expected maybe 5,000 viewers online, but because of the environmental angle and because the network decided to feature the green wedding theme, they are pushing it to their main digital feed. He paused, looking at me to make sure I understood the gravity of what he was saying. The viewer count is currently projected at 300,000, he said. And it is climbing. I looked at him. 300,000 people. Does Kendall know? I asked. Kendall thinks you are getting married in a backyard with a camcorder, Nolan said. She has no idea. I walked to the window and looked out. I could see the cranes for the cameras. I could see the satellite truck. I could see the reporter doing a mic check near the altar. My sister was in Paris, posing with croissants, thinking she was the envy of the world because she had escaped my boring life. She was checking her likes, counting her comments, feeding her ego with the validation of strangers. She thought she was broadcasting her victory, but she had it backward. She wasn't the broadcaster. She was the audience. In 30 minutes, I was going to walk out there. I was going to stand in front of 300,000 people. I was going to marry the man I loved, the man who built things that lasted, the man who didn't care about titles. And when the cameras turned to the groom, when the chyron on the bottom of the screen flashed his name and his real title, the title he had kept hidden from everyone, especially my status-obsessed family, Kendall's little Parisian escapade was going to look like exactly what it was, a cheap distraction. My phone buzzed again in Jules's hand. Another notification, another dig. Ava, Jules said. Kendall just posted a video. She's toasting to freedom from obligations. I turned away from the window. A cold, sharp smile touched my lips. Let her toast, I said. She is going to need a drink for what comes next. I looked at Evelyn. I am ready. I looked at Nolan. Let's go to work. That's my girl, Nolan said. He offered his arm to his mother, and they walked out. Jules hugged me hard, her sequins scratching my arm, and followed them. I stood alone in the room for one last second. I smoothed the silk of my dress. I checked my reflection. I didn't look like a victim. I didn't look like a girl who had been left behind. I looked like someone who was about to drop a match into a tank of gasoline. I opened the door and walked toward the music. The air off the Chesapeake Bay has a specific weight to it. It is not light and airy like the ocean breeze in California. It is heavy with salt, humidity, and the ancient smell of tidal mud and seagrass. It is a scent that grounds you, It reminds you that the earth is wet and messy and real. The ceremony space was set at the very end of the long wooden pier that stretched out into the water. It was a stunning architectural choice, isolating the altar against the backdrop of the endless blue horizon. The florists had outdone themselves. They had lined the aisle not with traditional roses, but with wild lavender and tall stalks of sea oats that swayed in the wind, mimicking the motion of the waves below us. The sun was high and bright, casting hard shadows that made everything look sharp and defined. There was no soft focus today. Everything was exposed. I stood at the beginning of the aisle, hidden behind a partition of white lattice. The music began. It was a cello solo, deep and resonant, playing a piece that was more haunting than joyful. I had chosen it because it felt like a heartbeat. I took a breath. This was the moment. In a traditional wedding script, this is where the father offers his arm. This is where the mother adjusts the veil one last time and whispers a tearful, "I love you." This is where the bride is transferred from one protection to another. A symbolic passing of the torch. I looked to my left. There was no one. I looked to my right. There was no one. There was only the wind rattling the lattice and the distant cry of a seagull. "Okay," I said to myself. "Walk." I stepped out from behind the screen. The reaction was immediate. I felt it before I heard it. It was a collective intake of breath from the 200 guests seated in the white folding chairs. They turned their heads, expecting to see a procession. They expected bridesmaids. They expected parents. Instead, they saw only me. I began to walk. My pace was steady. I did not rush. I wanted them to see. The seating arrangement told the story better than any gossip column could. On the left side of the aisle, the groom's side, every seat was taken. There were Nolan's friends from the industry, his mother's neighbors from Oregon, colleagues, and extended cousins. It was a sea of supportive faces. On the right side, the bride's side, it was a wasteland. The first 3 rows, the rows reserved for immediate family, aunts, uncles, and grandparents, were completely empty. The white reserved signs fluttered pathetically on the vacant chairs. Behind those empty rows were my friends, including Jules's parents who had come out of pity, and a few scattered co-workers from my time at Harbor Light. But the visual gap was striking. It looked like a smile with missing teeth. I heard the whispers. You cannot put 200 people in chairs and expect silence, no matter how solemn the occasion. The sound rippled through the crowd like a breeze through dry leaves. "Where are they?" A woman in a floral hat whispered loudly. "Is she estranged? I thought her parents were alive. Did something happen? Look at the front row. It is completely empty. That is heartbreaking." I heard every word. They landed on my skin like sparks, burning for a microsecond before extinguishing. I did not look at them. I did not look at the empty chairs. I kept my chin high, my eyes locked on the end of the pier. I was not walking down the aisle as a daughter. I was walking as a woman who had survived her own family. About halfway down the aisle, I noticed the cameras. There were 3 of them. One was mounted on a crane that swooped silently over the water, capturing the panoramic view. One was a Steadicam operator moving crouched along the side of the seating area, and one was fixed on a tripod right next to the altar. The red tally lights were glowing. I remembered Nolan's words. 300,000 viewers. I realized then that the emptiness of the chairs wasn't just a local tragedy, it was a broadcast. Somewhere in the world, on laptop screens and phone displays, strangers were seeing the vacant seats. They were seeing the bride walking alone. But I refused to look like a victim. I squared my shoulders. I let my arms hang naturally, not clutching a bouquet like a shield, but holding it loosely. I let the wind catch my veil. I wanted the camera to see my face. I wanted them to see that my eyes were dry. There was no mascara running. There was no trembling lip. There was only a terrifying clarity. And then, I saw Nolan. He was standing at the altar, framed by the wooden archway draped in greenery. He was not looking at the empty seats. He was not looking at the guests. He was not looking at the cameras. He was looking at me. His expression was not one of pity. That was what I had feared the most. I had feared that he would look at me with that sad, soft puppy dog look that says, "Oh, you poor broken thing." But Nolan didn't look like that. He looked fierce. He looked at me with a mixture of pride and intensity that made my knees weak. He stood with his feet planted specifically apart, his hands clasped in front of him, motionless. He was the lighthouse. He was the solid ground. He looked at me like I was an army of one. And he was the reinforcement. As I got closer, I saw him mouth one word: beautiful. I reached the altar. I didn't have to wait for a father to kiss my cheek or hand my hand over. I simply stepped up the small riser and stood next to him. The officiant, a tall woman with silver hair who was a retired judge, looked at the empty front row, then looked at me. She gave a nearly imperceptible nod of respect. "Who gives this woman to be married?" was a line she had wisely cut from the script without me asking. Instead, she began with a welcome that spoke of resilience. She talked about how the bay creates storms and how the shoreline is constantly reshaped by the water. Yet remains, it was a metaphor that hit close to bone. We turned to face each other. Nolan reached out and took both of my hands. His grip was firm. The camera on the tripod zoomed in. I could feel the mechanical eye focusing on our joined hands, then panning up to our faces. "Ava," the officiant said, "you may share your vows." I had written my vows on a piece of paper, but I didn't take it out. I didn't need it. The words had changed in the last 3 hours. The words I had written yesterday were for a woman who still hoped her family would burst through the doors at the last minute. The words I had now were for the woman who knew they wouldn't. I looked straight into Nolan's eyes. The wind whipped a strand of hair across my face, but I didn't brush it away. "Nolan," I began. My voice was low, but the microphone clipped to my dress caught every syllable. It echoed slightly over the speakers, carrying out over the water. "For a long time, I thought love was something you had to earn," I said. "I thought it was a performance review. I thought if I was smart enough, or successful enough, or quiet enough, I would be granted permission to belong." I paused. The silence on the pier was absolute. Even the seagulls seemed to have stopped to listen. "But you taught me that love is not a transaction," I continued. "You taught me that you build a life the same way you build a grid. You create strong connections. You remove the points of failure, and you ensure that when the darkness comes, the light stays on." I took a breath. I could feel the camera on my face. I knew this was the moment that would travel. "So today, I make a choice. To those who left," I said, my voice hardening just a fraction, echoing with a steel ring of finality. "I release you. You are free of the burden of me, and I am free of the weight of waiting for you." I heard a gasp from somewhere in the third row. It was a sharp, shocked sound. I ignored it. "And to those who stayed," I said, looking at Nolan, and then briefly flickering my eyes to Evelyn standing in the front row, and Jules beside me. "To those who stayed, I choose you. I choose the family that is here. I choose the love that is present." I squeezed Nolan's hands. "Family is not whose blood runs in your veins," I said, delivering the line that I knew would end up on every screen in America. "Family is who shows up when it costs something." I saw Evelyn's hand fly to her mouth. She didn't make a sound, but I saw her shoulders shake. A single tear tracked down her cheek. Next to me, Jules let out a soft, choked sound. I felt her squeeze my arm, a silent signal of fierce solidarity. Nolan didn't cry. He wasn't a crier. But his eyes shimmered with a layer of emotion that made them look like glass. He nodded, a slow, deep nod of acknowledgement. He wasn't looking at me like a savior who had rescued me from the tower. He was looking at me like a partner who was ready to go into battle. "And I promise you," I finished, "that I will never leave you empty. I will show up every day, no matter the cost." "I accept your vows," Nolan whispered. His vows were simpler, grounded in his nature. He promised to be the foundation. He promised to be the quiet in the noise. He promised that as long as he had breath, I would never have to walk alone again. When we exchanged rings, the metal felt heavy and permanent. "By the power vested in me," the officiant said, her voice sounding a bit thicker than before, "I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the groom." Nolan didn't hesitate. He pulled me in. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was a claim. He kissed me like he was sealing a contract with the universe. The crowd erupted. The applause was thunderous, disproportionately loud for 200 people. It was as if they were trying to fill the silence left by the missing guests with their own volume. They stood up. They cheered. I saw Jules wiping her eyes openly now. I saw Evelyn clapping with her hands high in the air. As we broke the kiss, I looked at the camera one last time. I didn't smile a fake, pageant queen smile. I gave it a look of calm, dangerous satisfaction. "Did you see that? Paris?" I thought. "Did you get the shot?" We turned to walk back down the aisle together, but the ceremony wasn't over. The broadcast had a schedule. As we reached the end of the pier, where the reception tent began, a man in a headset stepped forward. He was the floor director for the Coastal Morning Network. He signaled to the master of ceremonies, a professional broadcaster hired for the event. The MC stepped up to the microphone stand at the entrance of the tent. The live stream was transitioning from the ceremony segment to the impact segment, the part where they would talk about the fundraising and the environmental mission. The guests quieted down, sensing the shift. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC's voice boomed, "thank you for joining us for this beautiful union. We are live across the nation, celebrating not just love, but the future of the Chesapeake Bay." I felt Nolan tense slightly beside me. Not out of nervousness, but out of readiness. He squeezed my hand. "We have heard a lot about the bride's resilience," the MC continued. "But there is another story here today, a story about the man standing beside her." I saw the confusion on the faces of my friends. They knew Nolan as the guy who fixed wiring. They knew him as the quiet consultant. "It is my distinct honor," the MC said, his voice dropping an octave for dramatic effect, "to introduce to the world, for the very first time as a married man." He paused. The camera crane swooped down low, framing Nolan and me in a tight shot. "The founder and CEO of Everoak Renewables, the man who has single-handedly funded the restoration of this coastline, Mr. Nolan Pierce." The air left the tent. Everoak Renewables was not just a company in the energy sector, it was a leviathan. It was the company that had just secured the federal contracts for the entire eastern seaboard. It was a company worth billions. I saw the shock ripple through the crowd. I saw mouths drop open. I saw Jules's eyes bug out of her head. But I just held Nolan's hand. I stood there, in my silk dress, with the wind in my hair, and I smiled. The trap was sprung, the bait was taken, and 3,000 miles away, in a hotel room in Paris, I knew the champagne was about to taste very, very bitter. While I was standing on a wooden pier in Maryland, breathing in the salt air and the sudden, terrifying realization of just how powerful my new husband actually was. My family was 4,000 miles away, sitting in the courtyard of a hotel in Paris that charged €40 for a club sandwich. I know exactly what happened at that table. I know it not because I was there, but because the internet does not keep secrets. I know it because a 19-year-old study abroad student named Chloe, who was sitting 2 tables away, decided that the loud American family ruining her quiet lunch was worth recording. Thanks to Chloe, I can replay the moment my sister's life fractured. It was late afternoon in Paris. The light was turning that soft, hazy purple that tourists pay thousands of dollars to see. Kendall, my mother, and my father were seated around a small iron table. They had a bottle of expensive champagne in an ice bucket. Kendall had propped her phone up against the centerpiece, streaming the Coastal Morning Network. They weren't watching to support me. They were watching to roast me. Later, Lip readers on TikTok would break down exactly what they were saying before the audio from the broadcast took over. "Look at the empty chairs," Kendall said, pointing a manicured nail at the screen. "God, it is so embarrassing. She literally has no friends." "It is a bit stark," my mother agreed. Adjusting her sunglasses, "We probably should have sent flowers, just for appearances." "Why bother?" my father grumbled. He was looking at the menu, annoyed by the prices. "She wanted to play house with that mechanic. Let her sit in the mess she made." They watched as I walked down the aisle alone. Kendall laughed when she saw my dress. She told my mother it looked severe. She told them I looked like a spinster walking to the gallows. They clinked their glasses when I reached the altar. They drank a toast to their own freedom, congratulating themselves on escaping the humidity of Maryland for the sophistication of Europe. Then, the camera angle on the phone screen shifted. The ceremony ended. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone. My father was the first one to stop chewing. On the tiny screen, the voice of the announcer cut through the ambient noise of the Parisian courtyard. "It is my distinct honor to introduce to the world, for the very first time as a married man, the founder and CEO of Everoak Renewables, Mr. Nolan Pierce." The video shows the reaction in slow motion. Kendall froze. Her hand was halfway to her mouth, holding a flute of champagne. She didn't blink. She just stared at the phone. "What did he say?" my mother asked, her voice sharp. "What is Everoak?" My father dropped his fork. It hit the plate with a loud clatter that made the couple at the next table jump. "Everoak," my father whispered. His face, usually flushed with wine and arrogance, went chalk white. "Pierce, Nolan Pierce." He looked at my mother, panic rising in his eyes. "Martha," he said, his voice trembling. "Everoak Renewables is the firm we have been trying to get a meeting with for 6 months. They are the only ones with the infrastructure to retrofit the restaurant chain. If we don't get that contract, the operating costs for the new locations will bankrupt us by Christmas." "That is impossible," my mother hissed. "Ava said he was a consultant. She said he fixed wires." "He is the CEO," my father said, looking at the screen where Nolan was now shaking hands with a senator. "He isn't fixing the wires. He owns the grid." Kendall didn't care about the restaurant chain. She didn't care about the energy contract or the operating costs or the bankruptcy. She cared about the one currency that mattered to her: status. She watched the screen. She saw the chyron flashing beneath Nolan's name. Nolan Pierce. Net worth estimated at $400 million. She saw the way the reporters were crowding around us. She saw the way the guests she had mocked for being nobodies, were actually industry titans, politicians, and philanthropists. She realized that the boring wedding she had skipped was actually the social event of the season, and she wasn't there. The glass slipped from her fingers. It wasn't a dramatic throw, it was just a loss of motor function. The champagne flute hit the edge of the table, shattered, and sent a wave of sticky, golden liquid splashing across the front of her white designer dress. Kendall didn't even notice the cold liquid soaking into the fabric. She stood up, her chair scraping violently against the cobblestones. "She trapped me!" Her scream was so loud that heads turned across the entire courtyard. "She knew!" Kendall shrieked, her face twisting into a mask of ugly, distorted rage. "She knew he was rich! She hid him! She made him dress like a bum so I wouldn't want him!" My mother tried to grab her arm. "Kendall, sit down. People are staring." "Let them stare!" Kendall yelled. She pointed at the phone, where I was currently smiling at my husband. "Look at her. She's laughing at me. She let me leave. She let me get on that plane because she wanted to humiliate me. She wanted all the money for herself." That was the moment Chloe, the student at the nearby table, hit record. Chloe caught the whole thing. She caught the image of a beautiful American girl in a ruined dress, screaming like a banshee in a high-end restaurant. She caught my father with his head in his hands, muttering, "We are ruined." She caught my mother looking around desperately, trying to find a waiter to clean up the mess, completely ignoring the meltdown of her daughter. They ditched the bride for Paris, Chloe whispered into her phone camera, panning from Kendall's red face back to the live stream on Kendall's table. And then they found out who she married. Chloe uploaded the video to TikTok before she even paid her bill. By the time the reception in Maryland was in full swing, the internet had done what it does best. It had created a split-screen masterpiece. On the left side of the screen was me. I was standing at the altar, wind in my hair, delivering my vows with the stoic grace of a queen. To those who left, I release you. On the right side of the screen was Kendall. She was covered in champagne, red-faced, screaming that she had been trapped because her sister married a millionaire she hadn't bothered to Google. The caption was brutal. The class versus the trash. The video had 1 million views in the first hour. Back in Maryland, I knew none of this. I was in the middle of the first dance. The song was a low, slow blues number. Nolan had one hand on my waist and the other holding my hand. We were moving slowly, not performing for the crowd, but just swaying together in the center of the tent. "You okay, Mrs. Pierce?" Nolan asked quietly. "I am better than okay," I said. "I feel light." "Good," he said, "because I think your phone is about to explode." He nodded toward the table where Jules was sitting. My phone, which was sitting face up next to the centerpiece, was lighting up. It wasn't just ringing, it was pulsating. It was a strobe light of incoming notifications. I looked at it, even from the dance floor. I could see the name flashing on the screen. Kendall, then Dad, then Mom, then Kendall again. My father had evidently done the math. He had realized that the ethics clause in the Ever Oak Standard contract, a clause that Nolan was famous for enforcing, strictly prohibited doing business with partners who engaged in public reputational damage or moral turpitude. My father knew that Kendall's Little Paris stunt, combined with the viral video that was currently trending #1 on Twitter, was exactly the kind of thing that would void a contract before the ink was even wet. He wasn't calling to congratulate me. He was calling to beg. He was calling to ask me to put in a good word with the CEO. And Kendall? Kendall wasn't calling to apologize. She was calling to regain control. A text message banner flashed across the screen of my phone, bright enough for me to read from 10 feet away. "We need to talk. Now." It was the first time in her life she had used the word need. For 34 years, it had always been, I want your toy. I want your room. I want your attention. I want your design. I want your life. Now. She needed me to fix the narrative. She needed me to post a photo saying I forgave her. She needed me to tell the world that it was all a big misunderstanding and that we were actually a very close, loving family who just had a scheduling conflict. She needed my proximity to power. I looked at the phone. I looked at the desperate, frantic energy of the people who had left me in an empty house with a single sentence of dismissal. I looked up at Nolan. "Do you want to get that?" he asked, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. I looked back at the phone. It buzzed again, dancing across the tablecloth. "No," I said. I turned my back on the table. I moved closer to my husband. I rested my head on his chest, right over his heart, and I closed my eyes. "Let it ring," I said. We kept dancing. The music was sweet and slow, and in my pocket. The silence where my family used to be was finally, beautifully filled. The morning after my wedding. I woke up to a silence that felt different from the one I had left behind in the rental house. That silence had been hollow, a vacuum created by abandonment. This silence was heavy. It was the silence of a fortress with the drawbridge pulled up. I was lying in the master suite of the hotel where we had held the reception. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the aggressive Maryland sun. Next to me, Nolan was still asleep. He breathed with a steady, rhythmic depth that made the chaos of the last 24 hours feel like a hallucination. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. I expected notifications. I expected a few texts. But what I saw was not a communication log. It was a digital avalanche. There were 342 missed calls. There were over 1,000 text messages. My email inbox had hit its capacity limit. The notification bubbles on Instagram and TikTok were just solid red dots, no longer bothering to count the interactions. I unlocked the screen. The phone lagged, struggling to process the sheer volume of data trying to force its way in. I scrolled past the congratulations from friends and the shocked inquiries from distant relatives. I went straight to the source of the noise. The Mitchell family group chat, which had been dormant for 2 days, was now a war room. My mother had sent a text at 4 a.m. Paris time. "Ava, pick up the phone. We are seeing things on the news. People are misunderstanding. We were just shocked. That is all. We didn't mean to leave you. We just needed space. Call me." It was a masterclass in rewriting history. Just shocked. Needed space. As if booking a transatlantic flight 3 months in advance was a spur-of-the-moment reaction to stress. My father's text was shorter and more desperate. It arrived 10 minutes later. "The stock for the restaurant group is taking a hit because of some rumors. Don't let the internet blow this up. You know how the market is. Fix this." And then, Kendall. Her text didn't ask for a fix. It didn't offer an excuse. It was sent just 20 minutes ago, likely from the business class lounge at Charles de Gaulle Airport. "You win. Happy?" I stared at the screen. The words were sharp, petty, and entirely devoid of remorse. She didn't care that she had hurt me. She cared that she had lost, to Kendall. My wedding wasn't a life event. It was a game of capture the flag. And I had unexpectedly captured the flag while she was busy taking selfies in another country. I felt a shift in the mattress. Nolan rolled over, blinking his eyes open. He looked at me, then at the phone in my hand. He didn't ask who it was. He reached out and gently took the device from my fingers, placing it face down on the bedside table. "Don't," he said. His voice was rough with sleep but firm. "They are panicking," I said. "My dad is worried about the stock price. Kendall thinks I played her." "Let them panic," Nolan said. He sat up, leaning back against the headboard. "Ava, listen to me. Right now, everyone is waiting for you to speak. The media, your family, the internet. They want a statement. They want a reaction. They want you to get angry or forgive them or explain it away." He looked at me with that intense engineer's focus. "The most powerful thing you can do right now is nothing," he said. "You don't owe them a sentence. You don't owe them an explanation. Silence is power. Let them fill the void with their own noise." I realized he was right. If I engaged, I gave them a platform. If I argued, I became the crazy daughter. If I forgave, I became the doormat. But if I said nothing, if I just existed, happy and married and unbothered, that would drive them insane. So, I didn't reply. I left the phone on the table. We ordered room service. We ate pancakes and drank coffee while the world outside our windows churned itself into a frenzy. Because I wasn't speaking, the internet decided to tell the story for me. And because the internet loves a hero and hates a villain, the narrative was running away from the Mitchell family faster than a high-speed train. By noon, the hashtag #TheBrideWhoStayed was trending #1 globally. The video of Kendall screaming in the Paris cafe had been remixed into songs, memes, and reaction videos. People were dissecting my vows. They were analyzing my dress. They were digging up old yearbooks to find out if I had always been this stoic. But the most damaging part for my family was the speculation. Without my input to soften the blow, the public assumed the worst. They assumed abuse. They assumed a lifetime of neglect. They assumed that my family was not just selfish, but cruel. And they weren't wrong. Around 2 p.m, Jules arrived at our hotel suite. She didn't knock. She texted, "Open up. I have intel," and waited. When we let her in, she was holding a tablet and looking like a spy who had just cracked a code. "They are coming back," Jules said, throwing herself onto the sofa. "I assumed so," I said. "Kendall hates losing." "No, Ava. You don't understand," Jules said, tapping the screen. "They aren't just coming back. They are coming back for a show. I have a friend who works as a producer for a morning talk show in New York. Kendall's publicist, yes, She apparently hired a crisis PR firm an hour ago, is already pitching an exclusive. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. What kind of exclusive? The reunion angle, Jules said, reading from her notes. The pitch is that there was a massive miscommunication regarding the wedding dates. They claim they thought the wedding was next week. They are blaming the wedding planner. They want to land at Dulles Airport, drive straight to you, and have cameras present for a tearful, emotional reconciliation where they hug you and cry and blame the confusion on stress. I laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. They blamed the dates? That is the best lie they could come up with? It doesn't matter if it is a lie, Jules said. It matters if it looks good on camera. Kendall wants to spin this so she looks like the victim of a scheduling error, not a narcissist who abandoned her sister. She wants the photo op of the hug. She wants to be seen forgiving you for not clarifying the date. She wants to use my wedding as a PR laundromat, I said. Exactly, Jules said. Nolan stood up and walked over to his briefcase. He pulled out his laptop and opened it. She isn't just trying to save face, Ava, Nolan said. She is trying to save the money. He turned the laptop around so we could see the screen. It was an internal email from the Everoak Renewables Vendor Relations Department. This came in 20 minutes ago, Nolan said. The subject line was, Urgent Contract Review Request. Mitchell Hospitality Group. I read the email. It was from the chief financial officer of my father's restaurant chain. It was begging, literally using the word implore, for Everoak not to pull the contract for the solar retrofit. It mentioned that the recent social media misunderstanding did not reflect the values of the company. My father's company is leveraged to the hilt, Nolan explained calmly. They took out massive loans to expand, banking on the energy savings from our retrofit to make the payments. If Everoak walks away, the banks will call the loans. They will be insolvent within 90 days. And you have an ethics clause, I said, remembering the document he had shown me. Clause 4, Section B, Nolan recited. We reserve the right to terminate any agreement if the counterparty engages in public conduct that brings disrepute to the partnership. A viral video of the owner's daughter screaming about trapping a millionaire qualifies as disrepute. I looked at the email. I looked at Jules's tablet with the PR pitch. It all clicked into place. The text messages, the rush to return, the misunderstanding narrative. They didn't love me. They didn't miss me. They didn't regret leaving me. They needed me. They needed a picture of us hugging to show the bank. They needed a public statement from me to show the insurance companies. They needed to use my forgiveness as a currency to buy their way out of bankruptcy. Kendall wasn't coming home to be a sister. She was coming home to be a spin doctor. The realization didn't hurt. It clarified. It was like scrubbing a dirty window and finally seeing the brick wall behind it. They land at 6 this evening, Jules said. They are going to come straight here. They probably tipped off the paparazzi. Let them come, Nolan said. Security won't let them up. No, I said. I walked over to the closet where my purse was hanging. I needed to see it one more time. I pulled out the envelope. The white paper was slightly wrinkled now. Try doing this without us. I held it in my hand. I thought about the 3 decades of being the ground crew. I thought about the stolen design. I thought about the grid girl insults. I thought about the silence in the house yesterday morning. And then, I flipped the envelope over. I hadn't looked at the back yesterday. I had been too focused on the boarding pass. But now, in the light of the hotel room, I saw it, there, in tiny, faint pencil. So faint she probably thought I wouldn't even notice it. Or maybe she wrote it as an afterthought, a little secret joke with herself. Kendall had written 3 more words. You'll always come back. It was a statement of ownership. It was her belief that no matter how badly they treated me, no matter how far they pushed, I was the dog that would always return to the porch. She believed my loyalty was a biological defect she could exploit forever. She thought I was weak. She thought my silence was permission. She was wrong. I ran my thumb over the pencil marks. I could feel the indentation where she had pressed down. I looked up at Nolan. I looked up at Jules. I am not going to hide in the hotel, I said, and I am not going to give them their reunion. What are you going to do? Jules asked. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. I am going to check out, I said. We are going home, and when they show up at the gate, begging for their photo op, they are going to find out that the ethics clause isn't the only thing that has been terminated. You aren't going to talk to them? Nolan asked. Though I could see he already knew the answer, I looked at the back of the envelope one last time. You'll always come back. No, I said. I tore the envelope in half. Then I tore it in half again. I dropped the pieces into the trash can next to the desk. I am never going back. I grabbed my coat. Jules, tell security that if the Mitchell family arrives, they are to be treated as trespassers. If they refuse to leave, call the police, and make sure the cameras are rolling when they do. With pleasure, Jules said, pulling out her phone. Nolan, I said, turning to my husband, let's go build something. We walked out of the hotel room. I didn't look back at the trash can. I didn't look back at the phone that was still buzzing on the nightstand. I walked into the elevator, and as the doors closed, I felt lighter than I had ever felt in my entire life. My family was flying across the ocean to save themselves, but they were flying toward a runway that no longer existed. The gate to the estate was iron, 12 feet high, and currently the only thing standing between my peace of mind and the hurricane named Kendall. It was 2 p.m. We were still at the private residence attached to the venue, wrapping up the final logistics of a wedding that had turned into a national spectacle. I was in the library, boxing up the few gifts that had actually arrived, when the intercom on the wall buzzed. Mrs. Pierce, the security guard's voice crackled. There is a woman at the main gate. She says she is your sister. She is demanding entry. I walked to the window. The driveway was long, lined with ancient oaks, but I could see the silver convertible stopped at the keypad. Kendall was out of the car. She was wearing sunglasses and a scarf, looking like a celebrity trying to be incognito while simultaneously desperate to be recognized. She was talking into the intercom box with frantic hand gestures. I pressed the button. What does she want? She says she needs 10 minutes, the guard replied. She says it is a family emergency and she is not leaving until she speaks to you face to face. I looked at Nolan. He was sitting in a leather armchair, reading a contract on his tablet. He didn't look up, but his jaw tightened. Tell her to turn around, I said to the guard. I tried, ma'am. She is refusing to move her vehicle. She says she will block the exit until you come out. Nolan set the tablet down. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. It was a casual jacket, but on him, it looked like armor. Stay here, he said. No, I said. I felt a cold resolve settling in my stomach, heavier than the breakfast I hadn't eaten. I'm not hiding in the library. If she wants to block the gate, she can explain it to the police, but I want to see her face when she realizes the lock has changed. We walked out to the driveway. The air was still humid, carrying the scent of the bay. We took one of the venue's golf carts down the long drive. As we approached the gate, I could see Kendall pacing. She looked tired. The Paris glow had vanished, replaced by the jagged energy of someone whose credit line with reality had just been declined. When she saw us, she rushed to the bars of the gate. Ava, she shouted. Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual condescending lilt. Open the gate. My God, the paparazzi are going to be here in 20 minutes. Do you want them to see us fighting through a fence? I stayed in the cart. I didn't get out. I just looked at her. There is no us. Kendall, I said, and the paparazzi are coming because you called them. I did not, she lied, breathless. I am trying to protect you. Mom and Dad are a wreck. They are at the hotel. We just want to fix this. Just give me 10 minutes. 10 minutes to explain the mix-up with the dates. There was no mix-up, I said. You bought the tickets 3 months ago. Kendall gripped the iron bars. Fine. Okay. Maybe we made a mistake, but you are blowing this out of proportion. Look at you. You are married to him. She gestured wildly at Nolan. You won the lottery. Ava, you are a billionaire's wife. Why do you care if we went to Paris? You have everything now. Don't be so petty." Nolan stepped out of the cart. He walked to the gate. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He looked like he was inspecting a faulty circuit breaker. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It wasn't a wedding invitation. It bore the embossed seal of a firm I didn't recognize, Blackridge Counsel. He slid the envelope through the bars. Kendall didn't take it at first. She stared at it like it was a grenade. "Take it," Nolan said. Kendall snatched the envelope. "What is this? A check? Are you paying us off to go away?" "It is a notice of representation," Nolan said. "As of this morning, any communication between you, your parents, and Ava must go through Blackridge Counsel. If you text her, you will get a response from a lawyer. If you show up at our home, you will be met with a restraining order. If you block this driveway for another 5 minutes, you will be arrested for trespassing." Kendall ripped the envelope open. She scanned the document, her eyes widening. "You can't do this," she stammered. "We are family." "You resigned from that position when you boarded Flight 221, Nolan said. Kendall looked up, her face twisting. The desperation was mutating into something uglier. She realized the charm offensive wasn't working. She realized the sisterly bond card had been declined. So she played the only card she had left. "You think you are so smart, Nolan," she spat. She turned her gaze to me. "Ava, wake up. Do you really think he loves you? He lied to you. He hid who he was for 3 years. He played you like a fiddle. He pretended to be poor because he didn't trust you not to be a gold digger. He tested you like a lab rat." She pointed a shaking finger at me. "I am going to go to the press," she threatened. "I am going to tell them that Nolan Pierce is a liar who manipulated a vulnerable woman. I will paint you as the victim of a controlling billionaire who trapped you into marriage by hiding his assets. I will make you look like an idiot who didn't even know who she was sleeping with." It was a vicious angle. It was designed to humiliate me and vilify him. It was designed to turn my fairy tale into a horror story. Nolan didn't flinch. He actually smiled. It was a terrifyingly calm smile. "She can try," he said to me, as if Kendall wasn't even there. Then he looked back at my sister. "Kendall, before you run to TMZ with that story, you should know that Ava has seen every financial document I own. She has seen the prenuptial agreement, and more importantly, she has seen the personal security and confidentiality contract that I had drafted 6 months ago." Kendall blinked. "What?" "I didn't hide my assets from Ava because I didn't trust her." Nolan said, "I hid them to protect us from people like you. And regarding the lab rat theory, Ava knew. He was lying to protect me in the moment. Or maybe he was reframing the truth. But it worked." Kendall looked unsure. "And one more thing," Nolan said. "If you want to talk to the press about ethics and honesty, I suggest you remember the email you sent to the Everoak Grants Department last November." Kendall's face went from pale to ghostly. "I don't know what you are talking about," she whispered. "The email from KM Designs," Nolan said, "asking for $50,000 in seed funding for a sustainable fashion line. You used a fake business address. You claimed to have partnerships that didn't exist. My team rejected it because the due diligence flagged it as a probable fraud. But we kept the file." I stared at Kendall. The pieces slammed together in my mind. Last November. That was right when she had started talking about Paris. That was when she had told me she was working on something big. "You tried to scam his company?" I asked. "You didn't even know it was him, and you tried to scam them?" "It wasn't a scam," Kendall shrieked. "It was a proposal. And they rejected me. That is why I needed Paris. I needed to go there to find investors who actually understand vision. I needed to get away from this small-town mindset." "So you went to Paris to hunt for a rich sponsor," I said, my voice flat. "And you missed my wedding because you thought the trip would be your ticket to the high life. You thought if you posted enough photos from the Marais, some millionaire would slide into your DMs. I did it for us," she yelled, repeating the lie she had told me 3 years ago about the stolen design. "If I made it, I would have brought you up with me. Go home. Kendall, Nolan said. The police are 3 minutes away. Kendall looked at the flashing lights approaching in the distance. Not police, but the private security patrol for the community. She scrambled back into her car. This isn't over, she screamed as she reversed. You need us. You have no one else. She spun the tires and sped off down the road, kicking up a cloud of dust. We watched her go. The silence returned, but it vibrated with tension. Did she really email your company? I asked as we walked back to the cart. Yes, Nolan said. Under the name Kendall Marie. She didn't use Mitchell. We flagged it because the portfolio she attached was lifted from a student project at Parsons. She stole the images. I closed my eyes. It wasn't just ambition, it was pathology. She couldn't do anything without taking something that wasn't hers. When we got back to the house, Jules was waiting in the library. She had her laptop open and was on the phone with someone, speaking in rapid-fire legalese. When she saw us, she hung up. Okay, Jules said. I did what you asked. I called my contact at the bank, and I had my brother, the one who works in cybersecurity, look at the old Northridge logs you kept. And? I asked. The Northridge thing is definitive, Jules said. The device MAC address that uploaded the stolen file 3 years ago? It pinged off the router in your parents' house. But here's the kicker. The login time matches exactly with a FaceTime call Kendall made to her ex-boyfriend. We found the metadata. She was on her phone and your laptop at the same time. We can prove she did it. That clears my name, I said. I can petition Northridge to amend my record. Yes, Jules said. But that is the small news. She turned the laptop around. On the screen was a bank statement. You asked me to check the credit card activity on the joint account Mom kept, Jules said. I nodded. Years ago, when I was 25, I had opened a credit card with a high limit to help build my credit score. I had added my mother as an authorized user for emergencies, like if their car broke down or someone ended up in the hospital. I had forgotten about the card because I never used it. I assumed it was sitting in a drawer. Look at the transactions from last week, Jules said. I looked. Skyloom Airlines, 3 tickets, Economy Plus upgraded to business, total $8,400, Hotel Le Grand Paris, deposit $2,000, Galleries Lafayette, $1,500. I felt the blood drain from my face. I felt dizzy. I had to grab the edge of the desk. They hadn't just left me. They hadn't just insulted me. They had made me pay for their getaway. The champagne Kendall spilled on her dress? I paid for it. The flight they took to escape my boring wedding? I paid for it. The hotel room where they sat and mocked me? I paid for it. The statement closed yesterday, Jules said softly. The auto-pay is set to pull from your savings account on Tuesday. I stood there, frozen. All the times my mother said, Kendall just thinks bigger than you. All the times my father said, we are a team. They didn't see me as a daughter. They didn't even see me as a ground crew anymore. They saw me as a resource, a battery to be drained until it was dead, so they could keep their lights on. They used my name, I whispered. They used my credit. They stole $12,000 from me to fly to Paris and laugh at me. Nolan walked over. He didn't touch me. He knew I was in a state where touch might make me shatter. He just stood close enough that I could feel his heat. What do you want to do? He asked. I looked at the bank statement. I looked at the charges. Skyloom Airlines. I remembered the envelope. Try doing this without us. They had challenged me to survive without them. But the truth was, they were the ones who couldn't survive without me. They were parasites disguised as parents. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. The emotion that washed over me was cold and hard, like steel cooling after the forge. So that's what my name was for, I said. My voice was steady. It wasn't a name to them. It was a credit line. I turned to Jules. Download everything, I said. The Northridge logs, the bank statements, the email Kendall sent to Everoak, all of it. And then? Jules asked. Call Blackridge Council back, I said to Nolan. Tell them I want to file a police report for identity theft and credit card fraud. I want to press charges, and I want to sue for the repayment of the debt plus damages. Ava, Jules said, her eyes wide. That is a felony. That means jail time, or at least a criminal record. I know, I said. I walked to the window and looked out at the gate where Kendall had stood 10 minutes ago, demanding my attention. They wanted to be famous, I said. They wanted a story. Fine. I will give them a story, but it won't be about a reunion. I turned back to them. Lock the doors, I said, and file the papers. If they want to use my name, they can read it on a subpoena. 2 weeks after the wedding, that wasn't. I stood backstage at the American Resilience Energy Forum in Phoenix, Arizona. The air here was different. It was dry, aggressive heat that stripped the moisture right out of your skin, a sharp contrast to the humid, heavy air of the Chesapeake Bay. This was not a social gathering. This was the heavyweight division of the energy sector. In the audience were 3,000 engineers, policymakers, and investors. They were here to talk about grid stability, renewable storage, and the future of American infrastructure. But they were also here to see me. The story of the bride who stayed had morphed. It was no longer just a viral meme about a sad girl in a wedding dress. Because of the Everoak connection, and because of my silence, it had become a narrative about integrity. The industry was fascinated by the woman who married the energy tycoon not for his money, but for his schematics. "You look ready for a fight," Nolan said. He was leaning against a road case, wearing a conference badge that simply said Nolan Pierce, attendee. He had refused a VIP pass. He wanted the room to be mine. "I am not fighting," I said, smoothing the lapel of my white blazer. I had chosen white intentionally. It wasn't bridal. It was clinical. It was the color of a clean room, of a fresh sheet of paper, of a new start. "I am just correcting the record. Remember," Nolan said, stepping closer and lowering his voice so the stagehands couldn't hear. "Tell the truth. You don't need to destroy them. The facts will do that for you. If you go out there seeking revenge, you look like them. If you go out there seeking truth, you look like a leader." "I know," I said. "I am not going to scream. I am going to build." "Good," he said. He kissed my forehead. "Go get them, engineer." I walked up the ramp. The stage was massive. The lights were blindingly bright, creating a wall of white that made it impossible to see the faces in the crowd. But I knew they were there, and I knew who was there. My security team had flagged them an hour ago. The Mitchell family had arrived. They had used their old connections, my father's dwindling status as a local business owner, to secure passes. They were sitting in the 4th row, center. They had tipped off the house camera crew. They were ready for the moment. They were ready for me to look down, see them, tear up, and welcome them back into the fold. They wanted the redemption arc. They wanted the shot of the family hugging on stage, weeping, healing, and most importantly, saving their reputations so the bank wouldn't foreclose on their restaurant. I walked to the podium. The applause was polite, curious. I set my notes down. I didn't look at them. I looked straight into the blinding lights, right where I knew the 4th row was. "Good morning," I said. My voice didn't shake. "My name is Ava Mitchell. I am a structural engineer. I specialize in microgrid resilience and failure analysis." I paused. The room was silent. "In engineering, we talk a lot about failure points," I continued. "We talk about stress fractures. We talk about load-bearing walls. We talk about what happens when the foundation is compromised." I took a breath. 2 weeks ago, I experienced a catastrophic structural failure in my personal life. Most of you saw it on the news. You saw a woman standing alone at an altar. You saw a family in Paris. You saw a viral moment. I leaned into the microphone. But you didn't see the blueprint that built that moment. I saw movement in the 4th row. Even through the glare, I could see the shape of my sister. She was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. She was performing, She was playing the remorseful sister for the cameras that were undoubtedly panning toward her. The day my family left for Paris was the first day I stopped begging, I said. The words rang out in the massive hall. For 10 years, I worked in this industry. I worked at Northridge Aeronautics. I followed every rule. I checked every box. And 3 years ago, I was fired for a security breach I did not commit. A murmur went through the crowd. This was new information. The blogs hadn't found this yet. I was accused of stealing a proprietary design and entering it into a public contest, I said. The digital signature was mine. The device was mine. The evidence was irrefutable, but it was false. I didn't name Kendall. I didn't have to. I lost my career because the person who stole my credentials was someone I was taught to protect. I was taught that family is a shield. But in my case, family was the weapon. I was the ground crew. I was the one who paid the bills and fixed the wires so someone else could fly. I looked down at the 4th row. Kendall was sobbing now. It was theatrical. Her shoulders were shaking. My mother had her arm around her, looking stoic and pained. They were trying to hijack the emotional frequency of the room. They wanted the audience to think, look at that poor family. They are suffering so much, but I didn't give them the oxygen. I looked up, toward the balcony, toward the thousands of strangers. We tell women in this field that they have to be twice as good to get half as far, I said. But we don't talk about the tax we pay at home. We don't talk about the people who view our ambition as a threat and our paycheck as a communal resource. We don't talk about the fact that sometimes the sabotage comes from inside the house. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded piece of hotel stationery. I hadn't brought the original. That was with the lawyers. This was a copy. On my wedding day, I received a note, I said. It said, "Try doing this without us." I held the paper up. They meant it as a threat, I said. They meant it as a punishment. They thought that without their approval, without their presence, I would collapse. They thought I was a structure that couldn't stand without their scaffolding. I let the paper drop onto the podium. But they were wrong. That note wasn't a punishment. It was my freedom. The crowd was dead silent. No one was looking at Kendall anymore. They were looking at me. The narrative had shifted. I wasn't the sad bride. I was the architect of my own liberation. I realized that I'd been building my life on a fault line, I said. And when they left, the ground finally stopped moving. I was able to stand still. I was able to see that I didn't need to prove myself to people who only loved me when I was useful. I took a step back from the podium. This was the moment. This was the twist. My family name is Mitchell, I said. For a long time, that name meant something specific to me. It meant obligation. It meant silence. It meant paying debts I didn't incur. I looked at my father in the audience. He wasn't comforting Kendall anymore. He was staring at me, pale and terrified. He knew what was coming. He knew I held the cards. But I am not going to change my name, I said. I am going to change what it means. I gestured to the screen behind me. A logo appeared. It was simple. A blue architectural blueprint of a bridge, with the words, "The Mitchell Build Fund." Today, I am announcing the launch of the Mitchell Build Fund, I said. Starting with an initial endowment of $2 million, fully funded by my own equity in the projects I have designed. Not my husband's money, but mine. There was a gasp. $2 million was not a small number. It was every cent I had made from the Harbor Light buyout, plus the damages I was about to collect. This fund is for female engineers who have been blacklisted, silenced, or sabotaged, I said. It is for the women who were told they were just the ground crew. It is for the women who lost their jobs because they refused to break the rules, or because they were blamed for someone else's mistakes. I looked directly at Kendall. She had stopped fake crying. She was staring at the screen, her mouth slightly open. She realized what I had done. I had taken the name, the Mitchell name she wanted to use for her fashion brand, for her influencer career, for her legacy, and I had branded it with integrity. If she tried to use the Mitchell name now, She would be compared to this standard. I had just raised the price of admission to my own last name. "This is not forgiveness," I said, my voice hard as iron. "This is not a reunion. This is boundaries with a blueprint. I am building a future where merit matters more than blood. And everyone is welcome to join me, as long as they are willing to do the work." I stepped back. "Thank you." The applause didn't start slowly. It exploded. It was a roar. People stood up. It wasn't the polite clapping of a conference. It was the visceral reaction to seeing someone cut the strings. I walked off stage. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my hands were steady. Nolan was waiting in the wings. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, a look of profound respect in his eyes. He handed me a bottle of water. "You did it," he said. "I did," I said. But the show wasn't over. I had to get to the press room for the post-speech interviews. To get there, I had to walk down a long, concrete corridor that ran behind the auditorium. I turned the corner, my heels clicking on the hard floor, and there she was. Kendall was waiting. She must have slipped out the side exit the second I finished. She wasn't crying anymore. The performance was over. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright with a manic, dangerous energy. My parents were nowhere to be seen. She had left them behind to corner me. She stepped in front of me, blocking the hallway. "You think you are so clever," she hissed. Her voice echoed off the concrete walls. "Get out of my way, Kendall," I said. I didn't stop walking until I was 2 feet from her. "The Mitchell Build Fund?" She laughed, a shrill, jagged sound. "You stole our name. You stood up there and acted like a saint, but you are just a vindictive little brat." "I own that name," I said. "I paid for it, with my credit card. Remember?" Kendall flinched, but she stepped closer. She grabbed my arm. Her grip was tight, desperate. "You think you are untouchable because you have a lawyer and a rich husband," she whispered, leaning in close. "But you forgot something. You forgot that I was there 3 years ago. You forgot that I know what really happened at Northridge." I looked at her hand on my sleeve. I looked at her face. She looked deranged. She actually believed she still had leverage. She believed that the lie she had told, that I was the one who leaked the file, that she had just covered for me, was still the truth. She had told that lie to herself for so long she had started to believe it. "If you shut us out," she threatened, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "If you don't call off the lawyers and give us the money to save the restaurant, I will tell them. I will go to every reporter outside and tell them that you begged me to upload that file. I will tell them you were the one who wanted the fame, and I was the loyal sister who took the blame to protect your reputation." It was a bold, suicidal bluff. She was threatening to confess to a crime she had committed, but framing it as a favor to me. She thought it would be her word against mine. She thought the mud would stick. I looked at her. I felt a strange sense of pity. Not for her, but for the version of me that had feared her for so long. She was a paper tiger standing in a rainstorm. I didn't pull my arm away. I leaned in, so close I could smell the expensive perfume I had paid for. "You want to tell them about Northridge?" I asked softly. "I will destroy you," she said. I smiled. "Please do," I said. I pulled my arm free and walked past her, toward the bright lights of the press room, leaving her standing alone in the shadows of the hallway. 3 years is enough time for a scandal to become a footnote, but it is not enough time for a parasite to learn how to feed itself. I stood on the roof of the community center in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The desert air here was different from the heavy, wet atmosphere of Maryland. It was thin, crisp, and smelled of sagebrush and heated dust. Below me, a grid of 400 solar panels angled toward the southern sky, drinking in the sun. This was the flagship project for the Harbor Light Microgrid Initiative, a completely off-grid power system for a low-income housing development that had been plagued by blackouts for a decade. I adjusted the brim of my hard hat. My hands were rougher than they used to be. I spent more time holding voltage meters than champagne flutes. Output is steady at 98% efficiency. Mrs. Pierce, a young woman named Elena, said, checking a tablet next to me. Just Ava, I corrected her, as I did every day. And check the battery thermal regulation. It is going to hit 100 degrees today. Elena nodded. She was 22 years old, brilliant, and the first recipient of a grant from the Mitchell Build Fund. She had grown up in a foster home 3 blocks away from here. Now, she was the lead site engineer. I walked to the edge of the roof and looked down at the courtyard. On the steel wall of the battery storage unit, we had commissioned a mural. It was a list of names, the names of the 64 women we had put through engineering school in the last 36 months, and above the names, welded in raw iron, was our motto. Built, not begged. It was a quiet life. It was a good life. Nolan and I lived in a small adobe house about 20 minutes outside of town. We didn't have a mansion. We drove a dusty electric truck. We went hiking on Sundays. The world still whispered about us sometimes, the billionaire and the runaway bride. But in Santa Fe, people cared more about your water rights than your net worth. We had faded into a comfortable, productive obscurity. But shadows have a way of stretching when the sun gets low. I climbed down the ladder and went into the temporary site office. My phone was sitting on the desk. It had been vibrating for the last 10 minutes. It was Jules. Jules was technically the director of operations for the Mitchell Build Fund now, working remotely from DRC. But she really operated as my perimeter defense system. I picked up the phone. Is the website down? I wish, Jules said. Her voice was tight. Ava, are you sitting down? I am standing on a concrete floor. What is it? It is your father, Jules said. I felt a phantom ache in my chest, a ghost of the old reflex to worry. What happened? He had a mild heart attack yesterday. He is in the hospital, stable. But, Ava, the stress got to him. What stress? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The bankruptcy, Jules said. The banks finally moved in. They seized the restaurant chain last week. The house in Annapolis is in foreclosure. They are losing everything. I looked out the window at the solar panels. I felt a strange detachment. 3 years ago, this news would have destroyed me. Now, it just felt like a math problem I had solved a long time ago. I am sorry to hear he is sick, I said honestly. But I can't stop a foreclosure. Jules, I don't own that debt. They don't see it that way, Jules said. I have been monitoring their socials. They aren't blaming the market. They aren't blaming the bad loans. They are blaming you. Of course they are. Kendall gave a quote to a local paper, Jules continued. She said, and I quote, "My father is dying of a broken heart because his daughter chose vengeance over family. Her silence is the weapon that killed his business." Dramatic, I said. She always did have a flair for fiction. It gets worse, Jules said. Ava, she didn't just give a quote. She submitted an application. I frowned. An application for what? Welfare? No, to the fund. I laughed. It was a sharp, incredulous sound. The Mitchell Build Fund. She applied to my grant program? She isn't an engineer. She is a failed fashion influencer who is now doing... What is she doing? Freelance crisis management? She applied under the name K, Marie Mitchell, Jules said. And she didn't apply for a scholarship. She applied for a director's grant to launch a nonprofit initiative called, get this, the Mitchell Legacy Project. She wants $50,000 to start a PR firm for women in tech. Deny it, I said. Flag it as spam. I did, Jules said. But then I got a letter from a lawyer, a cheap one, strip mall variety, but still a lawyer. I leaned against the desk. Let me guess. She claims discrimination? She claims ownership, Jules said. The argument is that the Mitchell name is family intellectual property. She claims that because the fund is named Mitchell, and she is a Mitchell, she has an inherent right to a seat on the board and a portion of the endowment. She is arguing that you used the family reputation, the one she claims she built, to raise the money, and now you are excluding the family from the profits. It is a non-profit. Jules, there are no profits. She doesn't care. She wants control. She wants a salary. She thinks the fund is her inheritance. I closed my eyes. I could see Kendall clearly. I could see her sitting in a rented apartment, probably surrounded by unsold inventory from her failed fashion line. Convincing herself that I was the thief, in her mind, I hadn't built this fund. I had stolen her spotlight and monetized it. She truly believed that because we shared DNA, she was entitled to the sweat of my brow. She is threatening to sue, Jules said. She says if we don't give her a seat on the board and the $50,000, she will file a lawsuit for misappropriation of likeness and defamation regarding the Northridge story. She wants to drag it all back into court. She wants a discovery phase so she can leak things to the press. I hung up the phone. I drove home in silence. The desert landscape, usually so calming, looked harsh today. The cactus spines caught the light like needles. When I got to the house, Nolan was in the kitchen chopping vegetables. He looked up, saw my face, and put the knife down. "Kendall?" he asked. "Kendall," I confirmed. I walked past him to the small study at the back of the house. In the corner, there was a heavy steel safe. I kept the sensitive project files there, but on the bottom shelf, there was a smaller, fireproof box. I pulled it out and set it on the desk. I hadn't opened this box in 3 years. I unlocked it. Inside, the papers smelled like old perfume and betrayal. There was the hotel stationery, torn in half and then taped back together. "Try doing this without us." And on the back, the faint pencil scrawl, "You'll always come back." There were the bank statements showing the $12,000 of unauthorized charges for the Paris trip. There were the Northridge logs proving she had stolen my credentials. And there was something else, a printout of the email she had sent to Everoak 3 years ago, trying to scam them. I had kept it all. I had told myself I kept it for legal protection, but looking at it now, I realized I had kept it because I knew this day would come. A person like Kendall does not stop until they hit a wall that doesn't move. I had been a wall of silence, but silence is soft. You can yell at silence. You can lie about silence. I needed to be a wall of concrete. Nolan stood in the doorway. He was wiping his hands on a towel. "She is suing for the fund," I said, not looking up. "She claims the Mitchell name belongs to her. She wants to turn my work into her ATM." Nolan let out a low sigh. "She is desperate. The money is gone. The parents are drowning. She sees you as the only life raft left." "I am not a life raft," I said. "I am the ocean they tried to cross." I picked up the Northridge file. "She is threatening to lie about Northridge again," I said. "She wants to muddy the waters. She thinks that if she makes enough noise, I will pay her to go away just to protect the dignity of the fund." "Will you?" Nolan asked. "No," I said. "We pay ransom to kidnappers." "Nolan, we don't pay ransom to family." I turned to him. "You have the grand opening for the Santa Fe Regional Storage Hub next week, right?" Nolan nodded. "Tuesday. It is the biggest project Everoak has ever done. The governor is coming. The press will be there. National coverage. Is the guest list closed?" "For you?" "Never." "Good," I said. "I want you to invite them." Nolan raised an eyebrow. "You want me to invite Kendall and your parents to the biggest event of my career?" "Yes," I said. "Send them a VIP invitation. Tell them we want to bury the hatchet. Tell them that in light of Dad's health and the lawsuit threat, we are ready to talk about a settlement. Tell them we want to do it in person, at the event, to show the world we are united." "Ava," Nolan said, stepping into the room, "you know what they will do. If you give them a stage, they will perform. They will show up expecting a check and a photo op. They will think they won." "Exactly," I said. I looked down at the box. I looked at the evidence of 3 decades of emotional theft. "They think the silence is weakness," I said. "They think I am hiding out here in the desert because I'm afraid of the scandal. They think that if they push hard enough, I will revert to the girl who just wanted them to love her." I closed the lid of the steel box with a heavy thud. "Kendall wants the spotlight?" I said. my voice cold and steady. She wants to talk about the Mitchell legacy? She wants to discuss who owns the name? I picked up the box. Then let's give her exactly what she wants, I said. Let's bring her into the light, and let's end it where it began. I looked at Nolan, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt the sharp, dangerous edge of the woman who had walked down the aisle alone. We ended on camera. The Santa Fe sun was a spotlight that told no lies. It beat down on the pavement of the new regional storage hub, bleaching the color out of everything it touched. This was the day. The site was buzzing. We had set up a stage in front of the massive capacitor banks, sleek, silver monoliths that hummed with the potential energy of the entire county. There were 3 news helicopters hovering overhead, their rotors chopping the dry desert air. On the ground, the press pool was a shark tank of cameras and microphones. I stood next to Nolan. He was wearing a suit, but he had ditched the tie. He looked like what he was, a man who built things. I was wearing a structural blue dress, the color of a blueprint. "They are here," Nolan said softly, leaning toward my ear. I didn't need him to tell me. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere. A black SUV had pulled up to the VIP entrance. The doors opened, and out stepped the Mitchell family. They looked like they had been cast for a movie about redemption. My father was in a wheelchair, a prop, I suspected, given that Jules had seen him walking into a Starbucks yesterday, looking frail and sympathetic. My mother was wearing a muted beige suit, the uniform of the long-suffering matriarch, and Kendall was wearing white. Again, it was a calculated choice. She looked angelic, humble, her hair pulled back in a loose, romantic bun. She walked beside my father's chair with a hand on his shoulder. Projecting the image of the dutiful daughter, they moved toward the stage. The cameras swiveled immediately. The press sensed the narrative arc. The estranged family, the dying father, the reunion at the moment of triumph. It was catnip. I watched them come. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I stood with my hands clasped in front of me, waiting for them to enter the kill box. They climbed the stairs to the stage. My mother reached out as if to hug me, but I took a smooth, deliberate step back. She froze, her smile faltering for a millisecond before she recovered for the cameras. Kendall didn't wait for an invitation. She walked straight to the podium, where the microphone was live. "Thank you," Kendall said, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. She looked out at the crowd of reporters. "I just want to say, despite everything the tabloids have said, we are so incredibly proud of Ava today." She turned to look at me, her eyes shimmering with fake tears. "Family is complicated," Kendall said, creating a soundbite in real time. "But in the end, family is family. We are here to support the Mitchell legacy." She reached out to take my hand. I didn't take it. I stepped up to the microphone, moving into her personal space until she was forced to step back. "Don't," I said. My voice was amplified across the entire site. It wasn't warm. It was 0 degrees Kelvin. "Don't use my work as your costume." The crowd went silent. This wasn't the script. Kendall's face hardened. She realized the hug wasn't happening. She realized I wasn't going to play along with the redemption arc. So, she switched instantly to the backup plan. She leaned into the mic, her voice dropping the sweetness and turning sharp. "Your work?" Kendall laughed. A harsh sound. "That is rich. Ava, since we are being honest in front of the press, let's talk about honesty." She pulled a document from her clutch. "I am filing a formal cease and desist today," Kendall announced to the cameras. "Ava Mitchell has built this fund using the Mitchell family name, a brand that I built, a reputation that my parents sacrificed for. She is misappropriating our identity to sell her narrative. She is a fraud." The reporters started shouting questions. "Is it true? Are you suing your sister?" Kendall turned to me, a triumphant sneer on her face. "You want to cut us out? Fine. But you are going to pay us for the name you are standing on. We are the Mitchells. You are just the one who married Rich." It was a dirty PR move. She was gambling that I would settle quietly to avoid a public legal battle on my husband's big day. She thought I would write a check to make the noise stop. I looked at Nolan. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out an envelope. It was white. It was identical to the one I had found on my kitchen counter 3 years ago. I walked over to the podium and placed it in front of Kendall. "You like envelopes," I said. "Open it." Kendall hesitated. She looked at the cameras, then at the envelope. She had to open it. If she didn't, she looked weak. She tore it open. She pulled out the papers. The first sheet was a bank statement. "That," I said, leaning into the mic so everyone could hear, "is a record of the credit card transaction for 3 tickets on Skyloom Airlines, flight SL221 to Paris, plus a hotel deposit at Le Grand Paris." Kendall frowned. "So, you paid for a family trip. That was a gift." "No," I said. "That card was opened in my name, but the signature on the authorization form isn't mine. It is Mom's." I pointed to the frail woman standing behind her. My mother went pale. "That is a sworn affidavit from the bank's fraud department," I continued, confirming that the card was activated by a user who was not the account holder, without the account holder's consent, in the state of Maryland. That is called identity theft, and since the amount exceeds $10,000, it is a felony. The cameras were zooming in on the papers in Kendall's shaking hands. "You didn't just leave my wedding," I said. "You stole $12,000 from me to pay for your getaway car. You used my name like a credit line." Kendall dropped the paper. That is a misunderstanding. Mom just, she got confused." "Let's talk about confusion," I said. "Look at the next page." Kendall pulled out the second document. It was a technical log from Northridge Aeronautics. "You threatened to tell the press that I was the one who leaked the design 3 years ago," I said. "You said you took the blame for me." I turned to the audience. "This is the IP login history for the device that uploaded the stolen file," I said. "It matches the MAC address of a laptop registered to Kendall Mitchell. And the timestamp?" I pointed to the third page, a screenshot of a phone bill. The upload happened at exactly the same minute that Kendall was on a 40-minute FaceTime call. The data packets show simultaneous activity on the same Wi-Fi network. I was at work. She was in my living room, using my laptop, while talking on her phone. I looked at Kendall. "And just in case that isn't enough," I said, "the last page is an email you sent to your ex-boyfriend 2 days later. Subject line, I submitted it. If I win, we are going to Ibiza." The silence in the plaza was heavy. The wind whipped the papers in Kendall's hand. She looked like she was holding burning coals. "You have no leverage, Kendall," I said. "You have felonies." Kendall looked around wildly. She looked at our parents. My father was staring at his lap. My mother was gripping her purse, her knuckles white. They knew. They had always known. "This is entrapment," Kendall screamed, her voice cracking. "You invited us here to humiliate us." "I invited you here to give you a choice," I said. Nolan stepped forward. He didn't look at Kendall. He looked at my father. "Mr. Mitchell," Nolan said. His voice was respectful but firm. "Everoak Renewables closed a transaction this morning. We purchased the distressed debt portfolio of the Mitchell Hospitality Group from your primary lender." My father's head snapped up. You own my debt?" "We own all of it," Nolan said. $4.2 million, Kendall gasped. "See? They are trying to destroy us. They are going to foreclose." "No," Nolan said calmly. "We are not going to foreclose. We are going to hold the note, indefinitely." He looked at me. "We bought the debt so that you couldn't use your bankruptcy as a weapon to guilt Ava." Nolan said, "You can keep your house, you can keep your restaurant, but you will never, ever be able to use your financial ruin to extort money from my wife again, because the only person you owe money to is us." It was the ultimate checkmate. They couldn't play the victim card because we had saved them. They couldn't play the poverty card because we owned the bank. I looked at Kendall. She was trembling. She looked small. The white dress didn't look angelic anymore. It looked like a surrender flag. Here's the deal, I said. I pointed to a final document on the podium. A legal agreement. You withdraw your threat to sue the fund. You sign a full confession regarding the Northridge leak and the credit card fraud. You issue a public retraction of every lie you have told the press in the last 3 years. I paused. And then, you leave. You go back to Maryland. You never contact me, my husband, or my fund again. You live your life. We live ours. And if I don't? Kendall whispered. Then I hand this file to the district attorney, I said. And I foreclose on the restaurant tomorrow. Kendall looked at the papers. She looked at the cameras. She looked at the crowd of people who were staring at her not with admiration, but with pity and disgust. She realized there was no spin that could fix this. There was no reunion angle. She crumbled. It wasn't a graceful collapse. Her face twisted into a sob that was ugly and raw. I just wanted to win, she screamed. The tears finally real. I just wanted to beat you. You were always the smart one. You were always the perfect one. I went to Paris because I couldn't stand watching you be happy. I couldn't stand it. She slammed her hand on the podium. I borrowed your signature because I knew you would fix it, she cried. You always fix everything. You were supposed to just take it. You are my sister. You are supposed to let me win. The confession hung in the air. It was the truth. Finally, it wasn't about money. It was about a deep, rotting inferiority that she had tried to fill with my achievements. My parents didn't move. They didn't comfort her. They were staring at the reality of their golden child, stripped of her gloss, revealing the cracks in the foundation they had helped build. Kendall grabbed the pen. She signed the document. Her hand was shaking so badly she almost tore the paper. She threw the pen down. She didn't look at me. She turned and ran down the stairs, pushing past a cameraman, sobbing as she fled toward the parking lot. My parents followed her. My father's wheelchair whirred as my mother pushed him away, their heads bowed, retreating from the stage they had tried to steal. They were gone. The air felt instantly lighter. The hum of the capacitors seemed to return, a steady, reassuring vibration. I looked at Nolan. He smiled. He reached out and squeezed my hand. It is done, he said. It is done. I agreed. I turned back to the microphone. The press was silent, waiting for a closing statement. They wanted a soundbite about revenge. They wanted me to gloat. I looked out at the solar array, gleaming in the sun. I looked at the mural on the wall. Built, not begged. Revenge isn't what I did to them, I said into the microphone. I picked up the ceremonial scissors to cut the ribbon on the new facility. It's what I built without them. I cut the ribbon. The blue silk fell away. The crowd erupted. And for the first time in my life, the applause belonged entirely to me. Thank you so much for listening to this story of justice and resilience. I hope you enjoyed seeing Ava finally reclaim her name and her life. Please comment down below and tell me, where are you listening from right now? I would love to know how far this story has traveled. And if you enjoyed this drama, please make sure to subscribe to Kate Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit that hype button so we can get this story out to even more people. See you in the next one.